Welcome to today's webinar, Hiring and Firing Well. I'm Gabby Abubba, Growth Marketing at Atrium, and your moderator for today. Before I get into webinar logistics and introduce our speaker, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Atrium. Atrium is a corporate law firm and technology company providing fast, transparent, and price-predictable legal and business services to startups through our technology platform and innovative subscription-based pricing. Atrium is reinventing how professional services are delivered with a focus on improving the client experience. Founded by Justin Kahn and backed by Andreessen Horowitz, YC, General Catalyst, and more, we're trusted by over 400 of the top startups and hyper-growth companies in and outside of Silicon Valley. Now on to logistics. This webinar will be roughly 45 minutes of content and 15 minutes of Q&A. You can submit questions at any time during the webinar, and Kei, our speaker, will try to incorporate some of those questions as she's going along. We'll also have a time set out for Q&A at the very end and designate the time when we're about to get there before it starts. And now I'll pass it over to our speaker, Kei Drake, to introduce herself and dive into the content.
Thanks, Gabby. I'm Kei Drake. A little bit about me before we get started. I'm an attorney on the Atrium Counsel team working on general corporate matters for my clients. I joined Atrium about a year ago. Started my career at Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich & Rosati's Palo Alto and San Francisco offices, where I focused on corporate securities and related transactions, but really got the opportunity to advise clients on all stages of the life cycle, from incorporation to public company and all the transactions in between. Immediately prior to joining Atrium, I was one of two general corporate attorneys in-house at a biotech company, where in addition to advising on equity and transactional matters, I also advise on a larger breadth of issues, including HR operations and such. And so today I'm looking forward to chatting with you about this topic at hand and answering some of your questions at the end. So as we get started, here's a high-level outline of the issues that we're discussing today. We'll start with the importance of hiring correctly from hire number one, work our way through distinctions between employees versus independent contractors, go through some of the documents and some of the key terms in those documents when working through a hire, and then setting yourself up for a smooth termination when things don't quite work out the way you were hoping. And then we'll answer some post-termination equity-related questions, because we see a lot of those, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So hiring correctly from hire number one. I think a good place to start is always with some high-level non-legal advice with regards to hiring and firing. Working at a startup is very clearly not for everyone. As we all know, in this industry, it's a fast-paced environment, and founders are forced to wear lots of different hats: CEO, CTO, head of sales, head of marketing, head of recruiting. All of those are often bundled into one or two folks until you build out those roles. And similarly, I think, your first few hires should feel comfortable wearing multiple hats too, and taking on responsibility that's beyond the initial scope of their role, and eager to learn and tackle those challenges as they arise. I found, in my practice and in talking with founders that doesn't always end up being the case, and that leads to conflict down the line. So thinking about that from day one as you search for that initial hire, super important. I think it's also tempting to hire people who have similar skills because you can evaluate them best, or you speak the same language, and you just click fundamentally with these people. But often the most valuable hires early on, especially, are the ones who are able to take tasks off of your plate, who have expertise beyond what you do. And so I would really encourage you to hire for your most urgent need that you are unable to meet. And down the line, it has the dual benefit of limiting redundancy on your teams. So if you ever are in a situation where you need to scale back your workforce, you can do so in a way that is cognizant in terms of what you feel like you can give up at the time versus, oh, this is a redundancy and we just happen to hire someone who is fantastic, but you have now two people who can do that, and so you have to let one go. And I think the third high-level thought that I want to share at this time is, as much as you and your co-founders set the tone for your company on day one, your first hire, your second hire will too. And they will ideally become a manager one day, if not immediately. And so you really want to hire with that in mind. Is this person someone who embodies your values, who you can see managing folks below you and really helping you to grow the team beyond this first 10 people that you hire? Keep that in mind. A few employee hiring logistic notes. So of course, you'll need to pay your employees as soon as they're hired. And in order to pay them, you have to have an employer identification number, which is a number you get from the IRS. It's the number that you use on tax returns, similarly to like a social security number for an individual. It's just for a company. Most companies will register for an EIN as part of the incorporation process. If you incorporate with Atrium, that's something that we do for you. You can also get one by filing a Form SS4, but that's a little bit more technical than we're going to go into today. If you have any questions on what your EIN is, you can ping your Atrium team, and we're happy to help you figure it out. Once you have an EIN, you want to open a separate bank account if you haven't done that already. Most of the time, you will need an EIN to open a corporate bank account, so that step comes first. But the reason, obviously, you want to open a corporate bank account, you don't want to commingle your funds with your company ever. It gets very sloppy very quickly, and you just really want to have clean records from day one. Once you have those two things done, figuring out a method of running payroll, I think, is something that I would encourage companies to do sooner rather than later. Obviously, running payroll comes with a lot of steps. You have to withhold a portion of each employee's income for IRS purposes. You'll need to make Social Security and Medicare tax payments at a federal level. There are also state withholdings. It can get pretty complicated pretty quickly. Having a good payroll manager partner working with you and helping you to navigate that makes the process a lot simpler. A few other things that, are not top of mind for a lot of our companies: workers' compensation insurance and other insurance related to your industry. In California, at least, workers' compensation insurance is required on day one, the day you have your first employee. A benefits provider is probably a good person to speak with, or an insurance broker who can point you in the right direction as to what your options are. Additionally, being aware of minimum wage requirements from day one, super important. Quick Google search can help you to figure out what minimum wage laws apply to you specifically, but they can change on a city-by-city basis. So, for example, there's minimum $15.59 an hour. San Jose's minimum wage is $15 an hour. And they change on a cadence that's not necessarily annual. Sometimes it's twice a year, sometimes it's once every 2 years. So if you have any questions about that, obviously our Atrium team can help you to track that down, but you can also quickly Google it yourself. And then the last thing I want to flag for logistic purposes, eligibility to work in the United States. So U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS is the acronym that they're known for, requires employers to use what's called a Form I-9 to verify that every employee that a company hires in the U.S. is eligible to work in the U.S. The form is completed by both the employer and the employee that's getting hired. The employee will confirm their eligibility to work by providing some form of acceptable identification document, generally a passport or a green card or some sort of work authorization card. The employer has to then verify that identification document by physically looking at it to confirm their work eligibility, and everyone signs the form. You don't need to turn in the form or declare the form in any way, but the form does need to be completed within 3 business days of the employee's first. And you always want a I-9 form in your employee records, just in case. As I mentioned, a lot of these things are made easier with the help of outside providers like a benefits provider or an insurance broker. Atrium has community offers from benefits partners such as Gusto, can help you to navigate the waters a little bit. Feel free to reach out to your Atrium legal team if you haven't received any information about community benefits, and we're happy to share that information with you. So moving on to quickly discuss the difference between employees versus independent contractors and what we mean when we talk about consultants versus advisors. So before I get too deep in the weeds, I just want to step back and talk about how employment laws work in the United States. So employment laws exist at both a state level and at a federal level, and sometimes at a municipality level, like a minimum wage. But when federal and state laws conflict, the U.S. Department of Labor requires that we follow the law that provides the highest standard of protection to employees. So what does that mean in practice? We'll go back to the minimum wage requirement. Federally, minimum wage is set at $7.25 an hour as of now. But currently, 29 states, including California, as we discussed, have a minimum wage of greater than $7.25. So that means in those states, like California, employers need to honor the higher minimum wage. In practice, what does this mean? Well, this means that if you have a distributed workforce, employees in multiple states working remotely, then it makes it more difficult to ensure compliance because you need to not only be aware of the federal laws, but also the laws of each state in which you have an employee. Whenever a client comes to us with a request to hire in a jurisdiction that's outside of California, we'll suggest that you loop in local counsel in that jurisdiction to help you ensure compliance with the laws of that specific state or jurisdiction. And now I'm going to talk specifically about international hires for a second. So what I just mentioned about looping in local counsel and making sure that you're in compliance with local laws is especially true for international hires. Employment laws as they apply to foreign corporations, so i.e. corporations that are based outside of that local jurisdiction, can be super onerous and complex to follow and can come with major penalties for non-compliance. It's hard for us to give specific examples given that most of your Atrium attorneys are barred in California. Although we do have a few people on staff that are barred in New York or in Texas, none of us are barred internationally. And so that's why you will always hear your Atrium team recommend that if you're thinking about hiring internationally, you loop in local counsel to do so. I want to double down on what I just said and emphasize that if you are thinking about granting equity to service providers internationally, this is doubly true. Not only do we need to review the employment laws in that instance, we'll also need to review equity, securities, and tax laws of that jurisdiction. And by that, we mean that you'll want to have your equity incentive plan and plan documents reviewed by local counsel, in addition to local employment counsel reviewing your hiring plan and documents. The worst case scenario that we're trying to avoid, and the reason why we give you this advice, is that, the worst case company has a plan and issues equity to an employee located abroad. And the issuance of the equity itself and the way that we do it triggers taxes that are so punitive or so high for the employee that it almost nullifies any potential upside that the employee may experience. That would be worst case scenario, right? If just by approving an issuance to someone who lives abroad, you trigger consequences that make it almost redundant for them to have gotten the award in the first place. So that's really why we push to have your plan and your documents and your employment agreements reviewed internationally. All right, so now that we've sort of talked about that at a high level, I want to go down and talk about what is an employee. Who do we classify as an employee? So generally, anyone who performs services for a company is presumed to be an employee. And another word that we hear a lot thrown out to describe an employee is a W-2. That's essentially just the IRS form used to report wages and other compensation paid to an employee. As we all know, employees are granted certain rights and protections under the law, and companies are taxed a certain way for each employee that they have on payroll. Employees also generally receive benefits from our company, whereas independent contractors do not. The one distinction that I think trips up a lot of people when we talk about employees is whether an employee is exempt or non-exempt. And the misclassification of an employee as an exempt employee when they are actually non-exempt is something that we see quite often. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. When we talk about whether an employee is exempt or non-exempt, we're talking about whether that employee's role at the company is such that it exempts or does not exempt them from federal and state overtime pay requirements. So exempt employees are not eligible for overtime pay. They are exempt from the requirements, of overtime pay. Non-exempt employees are eligible for overtime pay, as well as meal and rest periods that are required under the law. Misclassification of whether an employee is an exempt employee or a non-exempt employee can result in significant liabilities to the company. So it's often top of mind for us when we see a job description that we feel may or may not fall into one of those categories. If an exempt employee is actually found to be a non-exempt employee, the company may owe back pay in the form of unpaid but accrued overtime plus penalties. So that can add up. Under federal law, an exempt employee is someone who satisfies a certain salary basis requirement, and their primary tasks as part of their job description fall within a specific set of duties. Either they have an executive function or an administrative function or an outside sales function, or they're a computer, like IT, sort of engineering professional, or they're compensated to a certain degree. That said, California has its own test of whether an employee may be considered exempt or not. Again, remember that, federal and state law applies, and whichever one is the most stringent / employee friendly is the one that applies. So for California, they actually have a slightly different test that requires a higher minimum pay rate and a more narrow set of exemption classifications. So if you were talking about whether an employee based in California is exempt or non-exempt, then instead of using the federal test, we generally have to use the California state test. I'm not going to go into too much detail beyond that, but I just wanted to flag that as a basic issue so that if you have questions, you can raise these issues to your Atrium team and discuss them further. This analysis really does turn on a position by position basis. And generally, if there is a potential misclassification, what we'll do is we'll loop in an employment specialist to really go through the job description with you, really understand the role, and see if we can carve it into one of the exceptions that's approved either under California law or whatever state is actively where your employee lives and works, and we'll work with you to figure that out. Okay, so that was employees. Independent contractors. So what makes an employee different from an independent contractor? An independent contractor is a person or a business engaged via contract to provide goods and services to a business. They're also called 1099s, which is the name of the IRS form used to report payments to a person who is not an employee. Multiple factors are weighed in the analysis of whether someone is a consultant or is actually misclassified and should be an employee. And this is another issue that we see quite often with our clients. The key question distinguishing an employee from a contractor is the amount of control the company has over the individual providing services. So if the business controls what work is being accomplished and directs how it's being accomplished, then likely the person is swaying more towards being an employee than an independent contractor. I think one good example in thinking about whether someone is an independent contractor or not is sort of thinking about the way you work with Atrium. And so generally, the questions that we ask, other factors include things like, does the individual provide similar services to other companies, i.e., do they have a business that, flourishes on their own? Or do they work for you exclusively, right? If they have other companies for which they provide a similar service, I think you have a much stronger case that this person is an independent contractor and have their own flourishing business doing the thing that they are doing for you. But if they're only doing that work exclusively for you, we're leaning more towards the employee side. Is the work that the consultant does a key aspect of the regular business of your company? So let's say, you're working to create a dating app. Yeah, so legal, equity, compliance, not an everyday key aspect of what you're doing, right? But you're hiring a consultant that maybe is writing code for your app and generating updates and pushing them through. There would be a bigger question there as to whether they are properly classified as a contractor or perhaps they are an employee, right? What does the contract say about the relationship between the two parties? So obviously when you sign on with Atrium, you sign an engagement letter. It clearly says, we are an outside third party providing services to you. All of our consulting agreements and advisor agreements will have this language that says we have an independent contractor relationship, just to clarify from the get-go if anyone checks the documentation. But just making sure that that language is included in the contract is key. How long has the individual been providing services? So here, I would say that if you hire someone to work 40 hours a week for you for over a year, that to me would signal that maybe this is a position that actually should be filled by a full-time employee instead of a contractor, right? The longer the relationship is ongoing and the more hours they work and the more they look like an employee, the more they probably are an employee, and we should talk about switching them from a contractor to an employee. Are they presenting themselves as someone who is a part of the company? This is also a key one, and I think the real takeaway is all about optics here. So, are they using company facilities? Are they coming into the office every day? Have you given them a laptop? Have you given them a company email address? Are they presenting themselves as part of the company because they have business cards that have your company's name on them? All of these things taken holistically should really be a signal as to whether someone is maybe a misclassified contractor and should be treated as an employee. Again, like I said, misclassification of employees and independent contractors can result in significant liability to the company. I'm sure many people listening have heard of this broader conversation going on with Uber and Lyft and their drivers, for example, and whether they should be independent contractors or employees. And so it's often top of mind for us as well right now. The difference between a consultant and an advisor. So for us at Atrium, we think about a consultant as someone who is paid to produce set deliverables by a certain timeline for a certain amount of money. So consultants are often creating IP or other valuable work product, working with you to push a certain project forward. Advisors, on the other hand, is someone who is a party who is generally, paid to provide business advice at a higher level, not necessarily working to provide specific deliverables or advice on a certain project, but generally providing advice and support on a rolling basis. Maybe before you head into a board meeting, you're like, what do you think generally about the strategic direction? They're not creating a ton of IP or valuable work product other than the advice and suggestions that they're giving you. But for all intents and purposes, both consultants and advisors are independent contractors and not employees. And so that's why we've decided to put that in parentheses here. So I'm going to move on to the next set of slides, essential terms for every hiring contract. So a few of these things are pretty obvious. But let's start at a high level and talk about the documents that each employee should have prior to starting work. And for those employees, it's an offer letter and what we call a CIIAA. Our tech team cutely calls them CHIAs, but it stands for Confidential Information and Invention Assignment Agreement. We'll start with the offer letter. So the offer letter is really a document that's signed between the employee and the company, and it lays out the full offer of employment for that specific individual. You want it to lay out the final terms of employment because that's what you sign as agreeing to when the employee comes on board. It's what at Atrium we use as a basis to fill out your equity tracker in preparation for preparing a board consent that approves equity, for example. So it's a pretty important document to have. But I think the main reason for you wanting to have an offer letter is to make sure that everyone is on the same page from day one of employment, day zero, I guess, of employment about what the employment terms are. So you want to clearly list out the position and the title of the individual, what schedule they're going to be on, full-time, part-time, or shift-based, if that's something that you're needing to have a position filled for. You want the name and position of the supervisor in there so that they know exactly who they'll be reporting to. You'll want to include whether they are exempt or non-exempt, as we discussed earlier. And then you want to include details of compensation. And that includes base salary and cash, equity details. If they're paid on bonus or commission, you'll want to include that, and benefits eligibility. So in terms of compensation, I would suggest that if the employee is non-exempt, you want to list their salary on an hourly basis because they will be getting paid for each hour worked. For exempt employees, though, their compensation is not tied to hours worked, and as such, you can list it in annual or monthly or normal pay periods. I think 90% of the time I see it annualized. Many companies will also want offer letters to state that compensation can be modified from time to time at the company's discretion. Again, I want to flag that you want to be aware of minimum wage requirements when you put together an offer letter. For equity, you want to briefly describe any terms of the grant. So the number of shares, the vesting schedule. You also want to be able to state that the grant will be subject to terms and conditions of your equity incentive plan and the employee's grant agreements. I often get a question about using a percentage of the company in offer letters when talking about equity. So for example, instead of saying, we have 100 shares outstanding and we're going to give you an option grant for one share, which is 1%. Can we include the fact that we're giving 1% of the company to the employee in this offer letter? I generally advise against that, and here's why. So going back to those specific numbers, for example, 100 shares outstanding at the time the offer letter goes out. You put in the offer letter that you will give this person one share, which equals 1%. Let's say, during the 3 weeks that it takes for this individual to give notice to the company after they sign their offer letter, they take a 1-week vacation, they start. Someone else exercises their options, or 10 people in a flurry exercise their options. And so now there are 200 shares outstanding as of the day she starts, but she still only is promised to get one share. That's no longer 1% of the company, right? In fact, it's become half of that. And so I think in order to be clear and to not have this kind of rolling conversation with employees moving forward, it's just much cleaner to give promise a set number of shares in an offer letter. Of course, there are times when it's valuable to list the percentage. And so I'm not saying never do it, but I would just be cognizant of the terms that you're using in the percentages. Another question we field quite often from companies and from employees eager to get started and get their equity is, when will I get my equity grant after I start? The answer to that is when the board meets next and approves equity grants. But, then the follow-up question is, well, am I not going to get credit for the time that I'm working if the board doesn't meet for a couple months? And the answer is no, you don't have to worry about that, because your vesting commencement date usually is the date that you start providing services to the company. So even if the board doesn't meet for a couple months after your start date and doesn't approve the stock issuance until that point in time, you'll get credit for the fact that you've been at the company for those last few months, because your vesting commencement date will start on the date you started services. The other question we get quite often is, what will the price per share be? And I think, as as an HR ops person at a company, that's a hard question to answer because you actually don't know what the fair market value of this share is going to be at the time the board gets together and approves this. One way of answering that might be, our last 409A price was this dollar amount, and that's what it is currently as of your offer date, but it may change by the time the board approves your offer. It could be, we closed a Series B round, and this is where the Series B investors landed. Generally, our common stock valuations come quite a bit lower than that, so you can rest assured that your price will be lower than that. But other than talking in that level of specifics, I would advise against promising a certain price per share. If you have bonuses and commissions that you're paying as part of your compensation structure, I would make sure that the offer letter briefly describes the terms of any bonus, whether there's a target amount or criteria or payment terms. And generally, we would recommend having a formal bonus or commission plan in place if you are paying in this manner. And that's just to make sure that you're consistently applying the same policy for payment across all employees who are eligible. You don't want one employee to be promised one set of things, another employee to be set. Having to track that is A, difficult, but B, facing a discrimination claim or something like that would be even worse. And so the more consistent you can be in your policies and the application of those policies, the better. In terms of benefits, you just want to state that employees will be eligible for standard company benefits that are available to similarly situated employees. We do often see, full-time employees getting access to a full suite of benefits, part-time employees not getting access to the same suite, and that's okay. But generally, similarly situated employees should have access to the similarly situated set of benefits. The offer letter should also likely inform the employee that the benefit plan details are available for review if they want to review them when they start, and that you retain the discretion to modify the terms of any benefits that you offer from time to time. And then the last two things really quickly, you want your offer letter to make clear that this is an at-will employment offer, meaning that either the employee or the company can terminate the relationship at any time with or without cause or advance notice. And that their employment will be subject to company's policies, procedures, and a handbook if you have one. And that, the offer is also contingent upon a background check clearance or a reference check, satisfactory proof that they have the right to work in the United States, as we discussed with the Form I-9. By including this kind of language, if something comes up later in a background check that you ran, you always have the right to sort of pull that offer back. One thing that I would not suggest you include in an offer letter is a description of that employee's future duties or the role. And the reason is, as we talked about, in a startup, you wear lots of hats. Specific duties of a specific role may change from time to time. And so you just want to make sure that you leave the opportunity to make those changes as needed. So a little bit about the confidential information and invention assignment agreement. All employees should be expected to sign one as a condition of their employment. And we generally suggest that it's signed before or by the end of the first day of their employment with the company. Basically, what the document says, for those who are unfamiliar, is that all confidential they learn on the job about the company, they will not use or disclose for an improper purpose or to an improper person. And that any IP that they create on the job or any work product that they create on the job will be assigned to the company and owned by the company. One of the questions that we get quite often is, can we revise this agreement? We'll send the offer letter and then we'll send the CIIAA over to the employee, and the employee will mark it up. They'll have questions. They're like, this doesn't seem market, whatever the comments are. Our general advice in response to that is, we would really, really, really advise against making any changes to your form of CIIAA. Not only does it set out difficult precedent for you moving forward, most of the time, to be quite frank. The requested changes are not in favor of the company. And I think more than that, from a practical perspective, the next round that you do and future financing rounds or an M&A transaction that you do, this will come up in diligence. Investors will often ask to review all copies of executed CIIAAs. And generally, what as company counsel we do is we'll try to push back on this request by simply providing the standard form that the company has everyone sign, plus confirmation that every employee has in fact signed this form agreement. So when you make exceptions or changes to the document, you'll have to track those changes to make sure that your, obligations that you're meeting are ongoing, but also you'll have to track to disclose those changes. And it just invites investors to ask a lot more questions, can delay the diligence process. Generally not advised. Especially when you're working to get an M&A closed ASAP. So I would generally just push back. One line that we use quite often is it's company policy that everyone signs this. This isn't negotiable, but we can assure you that these terms are very market in the Valley, and almost any company that you would choose to join would have you sign a CIIAA that contains terms that are very similar, if not exactly the same. One question that we sometimes get, if you have an employee who hasn't signed a CIIAA on staff right now, what do we do? And I think my advice to you is get that done ASAP. Forget the fact that it's late. Forget the fact that you should have done it on day one or before they start. It is much better to push to have these documents signed while you're on great terms with the employee and they understand that it was actually a condition of their employment to sign one of these things. And again, ideally, though, the time frame would be that you give an offer letter, then you share the CIIAA, you have them sign it prior to their first day. All right. So now we're going to transition from talking about hiring and talk a little bit about terminations, the darker side of HR operations. So setting yourself up for smooth transitions. Some of these I think are pretty common sense, but they're much easier said than done, especially if you are a company that still doesn't have a fully up and running HR team, because there are a lot of papers that go into an employee file and it's easy to miss. So I would say, the top piece of advice I can give is maintain good employee records. And so that means for each employee that comes on, make sure you have a signed offer letter, their CIIA, and their Form I-9 stored somewhere. It can be online in a protected box account. It could be physically if you have like a locked file cabinet, wherever it is. Just make sure you have those 3 documents for each individual. If there are performance issues, make sure those are well documented. And equally important, make sure that the issues are well communicated to an employee. The baseline. It is not good for an employee to first find out that they're having performance issues in a conversation that also discusses possible termination. That is really worst case scenario from an HR ops perspective. And so we really want to make sure that people are aware of any deficiencies or areas of improvement, and that they have a fair opportunity to address and improve those. In terms of exit interview best practices, you want to be prepared with all the paperwork. Generally, I advise my clients to make sure they give the employee a copy of an NDA, any NDA that they've signed with the company, copy of their CIIAA for reference. And then I will have them sign a termination certificate if they're leaving on good terms, which is just a one-pager that says, you have ongoing confidentiality obligations to the company, or a separation agreement for them to sign and take home to review if they're leaving on less than stellar terms. There are some required notices that you might have to give the employee. In California, for example, you want to give a change in relationship notice, an unemployment insurance pamphlet, some health insurance information. If you reach out to your Atrium attorney, they can send you these documents if you don't have them easily accessible. You do not need to share any copies of performance reviews or notes regarding performance. That can stay with you. Although I would recommend that you keep a copy of those things in your records, but not share those out. And the last thing that you want to give an employee on their last day is their final paycheck. All compensation that is due to the employee as of their last day of services, including all accrued and unused vacation. If you are a company that is not on an unlimited vacation policy, you want to be able to physically give them a check on their last day. And that's just required by California law. The timing of the last paycheck changes on a state-by-state basis. So if you have employees who are remote, that time frame may be different, but in California, it is on the final day. Things you want to collect from the employee on the last day. You want to collect all of your property. So things that often get overlooked are like building badges or keys, but obviously laptops to the extent you're issuing laptops, cell phones. You also want to disable all access to company systems. So one logins and email and calendaring. Preferably you want to do that during the meeting. And then you just want to make sure that you're checking your employees' cell phones so that you can rest assured that all company emails are erased from there, that they don't have continued access to Dropbox for your files from their phone, etc. I would generally say if the termination is amicable and you're just having an exit interview that consists of, hey, we really enjoyed working with you. Do you have any feedback for us for how we could even be a better workplace, and we wish you the best, then one-to-one is fine. One person from the company, one person, the person who's leaving that day. If it's not an amicable separation, then I would recommend 2 individuals from the company be present just so that things don't devolve. And that there is always that he said, she said component that, we can make sure to limit moving forward. So obviously of the 2 types of terminations, the ones that cause stress are the high risk ones, or the ones that seem more difficult, more sticky for whatever reason. And the real question that, my clients have for me is, when do I need to call you to discuss a termination? What makes something high risk? I think, most people have a good gut sense of when something is sticky and unpleasant. And definitely when you get that gut sense, call us. But there are a few certain cases that you should loop in an attorney for. Is the individual that's getting terminated a member of a special class or group? And by that, we mean, have they ever made a complaint to the employer or to the Employment Board of California or whatever state they're in? Have they ever filed a claim for workers' comp or harassment or discrimination or workplace violations or retaliation, anything like that? Have they taken time off for medical, military, pregnancy, or other protected leave in recent history before they're being terminated? And is there a chance that optically, even if their performance is horrible and you feel very justified in terminating the relationship, is it possible that optically this termination could be tied to the fact that they were out on leave? Is the individual over 40 years old? There are certain laws that protect age-based discrimination of employees over 40. And so if the person you're terminating is over 40 years old, we would strongly recommend that you reach out to your Atrium attorney. Do they have a disclosed disability? And were you making or not making accommodations for that disability? Do you have a minority with a possible discrimination claim? All of these things, no single thing is really going to point to whether someone is high risk, but you want to look at it holistically. And I think a great way to do that is to loop in your Atrium attorney and have a candid conversation about it. If the person is deemed to be high risk, and by high risk, we literally mean risk of litigating or risk of coming back and making some claim against the company, then we would absolutely recommend that you try to get a release of claims from this individual. A release of claims is also called a separation and release agreement. It's an agreement that's probably 4 to 5 pages long at most. And the crux of it is that the employee gets paid a certain amount of severance, and in exchange, the employee releases all future and current claims against the company that they may have as a result of their employment. The catch is, like I said, you do have to pay severance as consideration in exchange for the release. But we work with a lot of employment specialists here at Atrium, and I've heard more than one of them say that a signed release and separation agreement is worth its weight in gold. And the reason is that you just never want to have the risk of litigation really like looming over you as a company. The cost that, comes with paying out a separation agreement can be as insignificant as 1 or 2 weeks of an employee's pay. If you were to head down the road of litigation, engaging employment counsel, writing responses to demand letters, strategizing on the phone, losing sleep at night, having this take away from whatever product development you're working on internally, all the costs of all of that are often way exceeding the cost that it would take to just sign a separation release and call it. And so we generally do push our clients to go that route if they think that there is a real claim. But again, I think if you take one thing away from this slide, it's call your Atrium attorney for assistance if you feel like you remotely have a high-risk termination. On to our last slide. I think we're doing pretty well on time, but I'll try to be a little bit quick on this one. So post-termination equity matters. I think the big takeaway is that an employee stops vesting, or service provider, really any service provider, stops vesting on their last day of employment. So for employees with options, that means, usually they have a window of 3 months or 90 days from the last day of employment to exercise any vested options that they have. All unvested shares as of their last day will automatically revert back to the plan. And so they only have a decision of whether they want to purchase their vested shares or not for 3 months or 90 days following their termination. And I say usually because companies can change this depending on what's in their plan. So I would encourage you to ask your attorney what the window is. But for the vast majority of our clients, I would say it's 90 days. For employees with restricted stock, usually the company has a set period of time, again, three months or 90 days, to repurchase any unvested shares back from the employee. The window can be such that it automatically repurchases at the end of the 90 days, or sometimes the company needs to affirmatively declare that they're going to repurchase within the 90 days. But the repurchase price is generally the price at which the shares were sold. So for founders and early employees, 1/10 of a penny, 100th of a penny, etc. The one other thing I want to flag is that you really do want to notify your counsel right away when an employee leaves the company, whether or not that was unilaterally or a mutual decision to leave. Many clients are on a platform called CARTA, which is a equity management platform. And while there are many great things about CARTA, one of the less great things is that it can't tell when an employee terminates. And so unless we manually go in and terminate that employee ourselves, CARTA will continue to send automatic notifications. And this employee will continue to quote unquote vest on the platform, even if they shouldn't. And so the worst case scenario, I think, is when someone leaves the company, they don't have anything vested, but they were close to their 1-year cliff. We didn't terminate them right away in CARTA. And a month goes by and it's like, congratulations, you've hit your cliff. And the employee who's no longer with the company gets this false sense that they now have shares they can exercise, when in fact they don't. And so that's not a pleasant conversation to have. We just really want to make sure that your records are always up to date on that front. So please do loosen, regardless of whether a is a happy one or a more contentious one. Other things to think about: when you terminate an employee, and they have an equity grant and all of their shares go back, I think a lot of times as part of the severance agreement, in addition to paying cash, a company will come to us and say, hey, we actually want to issue equity. Or we want to accelerate their vesting so that they hit their cliff in theory, even if they don't in practice hit their cliff before they leave. So these are all fine conversations to have, and there can be an equity component to a severance agreement, but any change to an outstanding equity grant needs to be approved by the board of directors of the company prior to the employee being terminated. So let's say that, we have a company and an employee A who's scheduled to be terminated on Friday, and we want to accelerate her grant because she hits her 1-year cliff at the start of next month. And we think she's done great work, so we want to accelerate her and say thank you. We have to have a board consent approving the acceleration prior to Friday. Otherwise, on the day after Friday, what happens? Her shares automatically revert. All of her unvested shares, which is everything, because she hasn't hit her cliff, will automatically revert into the plan, and there won't be anything for us to accelerate at that point in time. So I just want to make that clear, that if you are thinking about making any changes to an outstanding equity grant in connection with a termination, that you loop in your attorney earlier rather than later, because there will be we'll need to take steps with your board, and that can take some coordination. So that's all we had for plan content, and we're moving on to Q&A. And I think we've seen some questions come through, so I will pass it over to Gabby.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kei. As Kei mentioned, we got a ton of questions, so we'll try to get to a couple of them before we have to close out the webinar. So first up, this is about co-founders and founders. What distinguishes an employee from a co-founder? And along with that, how can you move an employee or a consultant to a co-founder role?
So for me, when I think about co-founders versus founders, or versus employees, co-founder is like a title similar to president. And I don't mean in terms of importance or the role definition. It's just, to me, a title. And if someone comes to me and says, oh, I'm a co-founder, that doesn't legally really mean anything to me other than that they are part of this founding team and thus likely to have more decision-making sway and are higher in the org. So I just want to make sure that we're covering that. That's a distinction that might be very important to a company internally, but from a legal perspective, doesn't make much difference. So in terms of switching someone from a co-founder to an employee to a co-founder, it really doesn't involve much of anything. I will say, though, that I think there is a common misconception that founders don't need to pay themselves anything, whereas employees, you have to at least pay minimum wage. And I just want to clarify, it is true that under the Fair Labor Standards Act, at a federal level, and an employee who owns at least 20% equity in a company who is actively engaged in its management fits into an exemption and so doesn't need to be paid a cash wage. However, in California, the state minimum wage laws are more rigid, and California doesn't really have a separate distinction for owners and founders and employees and founders, meaning that founders who qualify as employees, which is everyone, needs to be paid at least minimum wage. And generally, we're on a little tangent from the original question, but the risk of not paying a founder is pretty low because the founder isn't going to make a claim for wages against his or her own company while he or she is leading it, right? But consider a scenario where the company doesn't grow as planned and a founder dispute ensues, and the departing founder who no longer feels so warmly towards the company claims that he's owed back pay. That could lead to penalties. That's really sort of the worst case scenario that you pay your Atrium attorneys to think about. And so again, I just want to be clear that, whoever you want to call a co-founder or an employee is an internal thing. It's up to you. And it probably sets some internal expectations as to the equity split. But from a legal perspective, it really doesn't change much.
Cool. That makes sense. And what are the caveats for promoting or demoting an employee?
Interesting. So I would say, for promoting an employee or demoting an employee, you really just want to make sure that you have standards in place by which you're doing that. And so, a lot of our companies that we work with don't have a lot of HR support. They don't have a lot of employees generally at the company. And so they haven't instituted methods of performance review or anything like that. But you really do want to promote or demote on as objective of a scale as possible. I think, what we constantly worry about when advising companies on employment matters is disparate treatment of employees of similar caliber. And, that just opens the door for, at best, bad morale and at worst, discrimination claims. I think even if your intentions are good, even if you think you have a real reason for promoting certain people or demoting other people, people will always find a reason to stick to why they didn't get a promotion or why they got demoted. And so the more objective you can be in making those determinations, the better it will be.
Cool. This next one is about fundraising and lawsuits. What is the impact of an outstanding employee lawsuit against a company during their fundraising of a seed or Series A?
Good question. So for me, what I think about when I think about the immediate impact of outstanding litigation, any kind of litigation, is the fact that you will need to disclose that litigation or the pending litigation to your investors. So for those of you who have gone through a financing, you know that in your stock purchase agreement, which all of your investors will sign, there are certain representations and warranties that the company makes to the investors. And one of those representations and warranties is usually a litigation rep. And the litigation rep reads something like, this company does not have, to its knowledge, any pending litigation against it, nor is it have any litigation pending in the foreseeable future, nor is it in trouble with any governmental agency, et cetera, et cetera. And so simply what you would do at a high level is you would disclose against that representation. There is a document called a Schedule of Exceptions that is created in conjunction with the stock purchase agreement. Any representation or warranty that the company makes in the stock purchase agreement that's not 100% true is then disclosed against in the schedule. So what you would do is you would loop in your counsel. You'd come up with, a quick summary of the litigation, what it's about, what the status is, how you expect it to resolve, although you don't make any promises in your disclosure schedule. And then you just simply tell your investors that that's what's going on. They will then, frame that risk of investing in you or not investing in you, given that additional risk that the company faces. But I think generally, no company will be the first to ever disclose litigation risk, nor will they ever be the last. And I think it takes a lot to phase Series C and Series A investors these days. And so you just want to disclose and be open about it.
All right. And I think this is going to be our last, if not second to last question. Can companies pay consultants via invoices versus the forms that you mentioned earlier?
Yes. So you absolutely can have your consultants provide you with invoices and pay those invoices on a monthly basis. The 1099 is simply the form that you will need to complete for IRS purposes at the end of the year. And so for your regular payment cycle, we often put language in our consulting agreement that says, the company will pay consultants upon receipt of an invoice net 30 from that date for however much is owed. Side note, you want to make sure that things are itemized in there if you have more than just like an hourly rate. So, the consultant worked X number of hours on this project, and there is a separate line item for costs associated with transit, et cetera, right? But no problem with monthly or bi-weekly or whatever cadence invoice that you want to work from.
Awesome. So we're going to wrap up with that. Thank you all so much for attending, submitting really great questions, and thank you, Kei, for hosting a fantastic webinar. You will receive a recording of this webinar via email to the email address that you registered with, free to share or view anytime on demand. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Have a good one.